Welcome to Crime Chronicles Confidential, the channel that brings you the darkest, most mysterious, and shocking real-life stories from history. From unsolved crimes to unbelievable survival tales, we dive deep into the events that shaped the world, stories that leave you questioning reality. Dark clouds loomed over Hiroshima. The morning of August 6, 1945, seemed ordinary. Workers heading to their jobs, children laughing in the streets, a city alive with routine. But then a sudden flash. A blinding light swallowed everything. In an instant, buildings crumbled, people vanished, and a firestorm engulfed the city. Screams filled the air as chaos unfolded. At the heart of this destruction stood a man, burned, wounded, yet alive. His name was Tsutomu Yamaguchi. He had just survived the most powerful weapon humanity had ever created. But fate was not finished with him. 3 days later, another explosion, another city, another nightmare. This is the unbelievable true story of the man who survived not one but 2 atomic bombs, a tale of unimaginable horror, resilience, and a twist of destiny so shocking it defies belief. Stay with us as we uncover how one man faced the apocalypse twice and lived to tell the tale. Japan 1945, life in the shadow of war. The year was 1945, and Japan was a nation on the brink. For nearly a decade, it had been embroiled in one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, World War II. The once mighty empire, which had launched a fierce campaign across the Pacific, was now struggling to hold its ground. The tides of war had turned, and Japan was beginning to crumble under the relentless assault of the Allied forces. A nation under siege. By mid-1945, Japan was a nation suffocating under the weight of war. The once thriving cities were now landscapes of devastation, with entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble by relentless bombing raids. Factories struggled to produce weapons and supplies as raw materials grew scarce. Food was rationed, and the people, especially those in major cities, were starving. American bombers had already reduced Tokyo to ruins in a massive firebombing campaign that had killed over 100,000 people in a single night. But the worst was yet to come. The enemy's new secret weapon, a force unlike anything the world had ever seen, was about to be unleashed. The people's struggle. For the Japanese people, daily life had become a fight for survival. Men who weren't on the battlefield were working in war industries, their backs bent under the weight of endless labor. Women and children took up jobs in factories making bullets, sewing military uniforms, and assembling aircraft parts. Even school children were taught to prepare for an American invasion, training with bamboo spears in case they had to fight to the death. Air raid sirens were an almost daily occurrence, a grim reminder that death could fall from the sky at any moment. People lived in constant fear, ready to run to underground shelters at a moment's notice. At night, entire cities went dark as civilians extinguished their lights to avoid detection by enemy bombers. Despite this hardship, a deep sense of national duty and sacrifice kept the people going. The government had instilled the idea that surrender was not an option, that Japan would fight to the last man, woman, and child if necessary. Propaganda posters filled the streets, urging citizens to endure suffering for the sake of the emperor. The people were exhausted, but they had no choice but to keep moving forward. A crumbling empire. On the battlefront, Japan's situation was dire. The once formidable Imperial Navy had been crippled. The army was suffering defeat after defeat, and territories that had been conquered years ago were now falling back into enemy hands. The Americans had captured Iwo Jima and Okinawa, islands close enough to launch a direct invasion of the Japanese mainland. Every day, B-29 bombers filled the skies, dropping tons of explosives over Japan cities. The government was aware that defeat was near, but it refused to give up. The top military leaders believed that if they held out long enough, they could force the Allies to negotiate better surrender terms. However, there was one terrifying reality they did not know. The United States had developed a weapon powerful enough to end the war in an instant. Hiroshima, a city unaware of its fate. Amid this chaos, The city of Hiroshima stood as an important military and industrial hub. Factories churned out weapons, while thousands of soldiers were stationed there. But to its residents, life continued as best as it could. Despite the ongoing war, people tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. One of those people was Tsutomu Yamaguchi, a 29-year-old naval engineer working for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Like many others, he was exhausted by years of war, but kept working, believing in his duty to support Japan's efforts. On the morning of August 6, 1945, he was preparing to leave Hiroshima after a 3-month work assignment. He had no idea that in just a few hours his life and the world would change forever. The calm before the storm. As the sun rose over Hiroshima that morning, people went about their day as usual. Farmers tended their fields, shopkeepers opened their stores, and children headed to school. No one knew that high above them, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay was approaching, carrying a bomb unlike any other. The city's fate was sealed. Within moments, the world would witness the dawn of a new era, one of fire, destruction, and unspeakable horror. And in the midst of it all, Tsutomu Yamaguchi would stand face to face with death itself. Tsutomu Yamaguchi, an ordinary man with an extraordinary fate. Amid the chaos of war, where nations clashed and millions perished, some stories defy logic. Stories so unbelievable that they seem like pure fiction. This is one such story. It is the story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi, an ordinary man who unknowingly walked straight into history, becoming one of the only known survivors of both atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A humble beginning. Born on March 16, 1916, in Nagasaki, Japan, Tsutomu Yamaguchi grew up in a traditional Japanese household. He was raised with values of hard work, discipline, and loyalty to his country, traits that would define him for the rest of his life. Like many young men of his time, he had dreams of a simple life, a stable career, a loving family, and a peaceful future. Yamaguchi was an intelligent and diligent student. His passion for engineering and technology led him to pursue a career in naval engineering, a profession that was in high demand during the war. He eventually secured a job at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, one of Japan's largest industrial companies. A man of duty in a nation at war. By the early 1940s, Japan was fully engaged in World War II, and the country's industries had been redirected towards supporting the war effort. As an engineer at Mitsubishi, Yamaguchi was tasked with designing and overseeing the construction of oil tankers, a crucial part of Japan's military operations. These tankers supplied fuel for warships, aircraft, and military vehicles, making them vital assets in Japan's fight against the Allies. Though he was not a soldier, Yamaguchi played an essential role in the war. He spent long hours ensuring that the ships were built efficiently and according to strict military standards. He took great pride in his work, not just for the sake of his job, but because he believed in protecting his homeland. However, like many others, Yamaguchi also despised the war. He had seen its effects firsthand. The bombings, the starvation, the never-ending cycle of destruction. He longed for a time when Japan could return to peace. The work assignment that changed everything. In the summer of 1945, Yamaguchi was sent on a 3-month work assignment to Hiroshima along with 2 colleagues. Their mission was to assist in the design and construction of a new oil tanker at Mitsubishi's shipyard in the city. For 3 long months, he worked tirelessly, unaware that his final day in Hiroshima would be unlike any other. On August 6, 1945, Yamaguchi woke up early, preparing for his return journey to Nagasaki. His assignment in Hiroshima was complete, and he was eager to reunite with his wife and young son. As he packed his bags and prepared to leave, he had no idea that fate had other plans for him. By 8:15 a.m., his life, and the world, was about to change forever. What happened next was beyond human imagination. The sky erupted into fire, the air turned to poison, and the city he had just worked in for months ceased to exist in an instant. Tsutomu Yamaguchi had just become a witness and a survivor of the first atomic bomb ever used in war. But his journey was far from over. Hiroshima Journey, A game of fate. In the summer of 1945, as World War II raged on, Tsutomu Yamaguchi found himself far from home, stationed in Hiroshima on a crucial work assignment. He had been sent by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, along with two of his colleagues, to oversee the final stages of oil tanker construction, a vital part of Japan's war effort. The city of Hiroshima, though untouched by firebombing unlike other major Japanese cities, was not at peace. The war had drained its resources, and the people lived under constant fear of an American invasion. Air raid sirens were a daily occurrence, though many had become desensitized, as the warnings often led to nothing. The people of Hiroshima believed they were somewhat safe. After all, the city had never been targeted by the relentless bombings that had turned cities like Tokyo and Osaka into ruins. But that false sense of security was about to be shattered. A city on edge. When Yamaguchi arrived in Hiroshima in May 1945, the city was still functioning, but the war had changed its soul. Shops operated with limited goods due to food rationing. Factories ran nonstop, producing weapons, ships, and military supplies. Men, women, and even children were involved in some form of war work. Everywhere he went, he could see the impact of war. Young men, barely in their 20s, were being sent to the front lines, many never to return. Mothers held on to their children tightly, hoping they wouldn't grow up in a world of endless conflict. Families had built bomb shelters near their homes, unsure if they would ever need them. Despite this tension, life carried on. Trains ran, businesses operated, and people tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. However, the war's psychological toll was heavy. No one knew when the next attack might come. A war economy. As an engineer, Yamaguchi worked tirelessly at the Mitsubishi shipyard. His primary responsibility was to ensure that oil tankers were being built efficiently, as they were essential for transporting fuel to Japan's dwindling navy. The long workdays left him exhausted, but he remained committed. Japan's war strategy was shifting. The enemy forces were advancing, and the military needed all the resources it could get. Every ship built was another step toward prolonging the war. Yamaguchi, though proud of his work, couldn't ignore the growing sense of doom. He had heard rumors of America possessing a superweapon, but like most Japanese civilians, he dismissed them as mere propaganda. The final day in Hiroshima. After 3 grueling months, Yamaguchi's assignment was finally complete. August 6, 1945, was supposed to be his last morning in Hiroshima. He and his colleagues had finished their duties and were preparing to return to Nagasaki. That morning, Yamaguchi woke up early. His bags were packed, his mind set on home. He had spent enough time in Hiroshima, and he was eager to return to his wife and young son. He left his lodging and made his way toward the Mitsubishi shipyard one final time. As he walked through the city streets, he had no idea that in just a few minutes his life and the fate of Hiroshima would change forever. At exactly 8:15 a.m., as Yamaguchi reached the shipyard, a bright light illuminated the sky, followed by a deafening explosion. In the blink of an eye, his world turned into fire and ash. Doomsday, the moment the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. The morning of August 6, 1945, began like any other in Hiroshima. The city was waking up. People were preparing for another day of work, and the air raid sirens had gone off earlier but, as usual, had been ignored. The war had made people accustomed to false alarms. Little did they know, this was no ordinary morning. The last moments of normalcy. At 7:30 a.m., a single B-29 bomber named Enola Gay was detected on Japan's radar. However, the Japanese military, believing it to be a reconnaissance plane, did not sound a major alarm. It was just another American aircraft flying overhead. Nothing out of the ordinary. Meanwhile, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was making his way toward the Mitsubishi shipyard for one final visit before leaving Hiroshima. He walked through the city streets, past factories, homes, and markets, unaware that fate had placed him in the exact location of a catastrophe unlike any the world had ever seen. By 8:15 a.m., As Yamaguchi arrived near the shipyard, he looked up at the sky. A tiny speck, something metallic, was falling. He squinted in confusion, and then everything changed, the flash that turned day into hell. Without warning, an intense flash of blue-white light erupted in the sky. It was so bright that for a moment, Yamaguchi thought the sun itself had exploded. Before he could react, a massive shockwave slammed into him, knocking him off his feet. The force was so powerful that buildings collapsed like houses of cards, glass windows shattered into deadly shrapnel, and a violent firestorm engulfed the entire city. It was not just an explosion. It was the birth of an apocalypse. The bomb, named Little Boy, had detonated about 600 meters above the ground, releasing the destructive power of 15,000 tons of TNT. A blinding fireball consumed everything within a 1-mile radius. The temperature of the epicenter surged to over 4,000 degrees Celsius, 7,200 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the surface of the sun. People standing directly under the explosion were instantly vaporized, leaving only their shadows burned into the ground. A city destroyed in seconds. Yamaguchi, though 3 kilometers, 1.8 miles, from the epicenter, was still close enough to face death. The force of the blast sent him flying into a nearby ditch. His eardrums burst, and his skin was scorched by the intense heat. A powerful gust of wind carried debris, fire, and glass, turning the world into a storm of flames and destruction. When the deafening explosion subsided, an eerie silence followed. Yamaguchi, stunned and barely conscious, slowly opened his eyes. The sky had turned black, filled with rising smoke and a strange, thick black rain, radioactive fallout that carried the poison of the bomb. The Hiroshima he had walked through minutes ago no longer existed. Where houses and buildings once stood, there was now only fire and rubble. The streets were filled with charred bodies, some still standing in the last position they were in before the explosion, frozen in death. Others wandered through the ruins, skin peeling off their bones, their faces unrecognizable. It was as if hell itself had descended on earth. Yamaguchi struggled to survive. In agony, his left side covered in burns, Yamaguchi staggered through the ruins. He couldn't believe what had happened. He saw rivers filled with floating corpses, buildings turned into nothing but piles of ash, and people begging for water, their voices weak and raspy. Some had their eyes melted shut from the extreme heat. Others, barely alive, were so horrifically burned that their skin hung from their bodies in long, grotesque strips. He wanted to help. He wanted to scream. But he had no strength. His body was weak, his vision blurred, and the pain of his burns was unbearable. Somehow, he managed to drag himself toward an air raid shelter, where survivors had gathered, men, women, and children, all burned, bleeding, and barely clinging to life. But for Yamaguchi, this nightmare was not over yet. With his body broken and his mind in shock, one thought ran through his head. I must get home. I must get to Nagasaki. He had no idea that in just 3 days, he would face this nightmare again. A city covered in fire and ash. When Tsutomu Yamaguchi regained consciousness, the world around him had changed beyond recognition. Hiroshima was no longer a city. It was an inferno, a wasteland of death and destruction. Where there had once been bustling streets, markets, homes, and factories, there was now only blackened ruins and endless flames. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of burning flesh. The once proud city had been reduced to a charred skeleton, its buildings obliterated, its people either vaporized or left to suffer in unimaginable agony. A hell on earth. The sky, once bright and blue, was now a swirling mass of darkness, choked with thick, black smoke rising from the ruins. The heat was unbearable. Fires raged across the city, consuming everything in their path. Those who had survived the initial blast were now trapped in a fiery nightmare, their screams lost in the chaos. Hiroshima's streets had turned into rivers of death. Piles of bodies lay motionless, some burned beyond recognition. Others twisted in unnatural positions, as if they had frozen in pain the moment the bomb exploded. Some bodies were still standing, their shadows permanently etched onto walls and streets. The only evidence they had ever existed. The walking dead. As Yamaguchi staggered through the ruins, he saw figures emerging from the smoke. Human shapes, but barely recognizable as people. Their skin hung from their bodies in long, melted strips. Their hair had burned off, their faces swollen beyond recognition. Some had lost their eyes, their sockets empty, blood trickling down their cheeks. Many walked silently, their minds unable to process the horror they had just endured. One woman clutched a small bundle in her arms, whispering softly, rocking back and forth. It was her child, lifeless, burned unrecognizable. But she refused to let go. A man staggered past, his flesh peeling away, his voice hoarse as he begged for water. Others reached out with trembling hands, their lips cracked, their tongues swollen. Water, water. But those who drank from the city's rivers did not survive for long. The water had been contaminated by radiation and the falling ash, and drinking it only hastened their deaths. The black rain. From the darkened sky, a strange rain began to fall, thick black and filled with ash. This was no ordinary rain. It was the fallout from the bomb, a deadly mix of radioactive particles, dirt, and human remains. Some survivors, desperate for relief, tilted their heads back and opened their mouths, drinking the rain, unaware that they were swallowing death itself. The city had become a graveyard, where the living envied the dead. Yamaguchi's fight for survival. With burned skin, ruptured eardrums, and the shock of witnessing an entire city's annihilation, Yamaguchi somehow found the strength to keep moving. He had only one thought. I must survive. I must return to Nagasaki. Through streets filled with charred corpses and shattered buildings, he dragged himself toward an air raid shelter, where other survivors had gathered. They sat in silence, their faces blank, their bodies trembling. Some whispered prayers, others sobbed quietly, and some simply stared into nothingness, their minds unable to comprehend what had happened. But Yamaguchi knew he couldn't stay. His wife and son were in Nagasaki. He had to reach them. In unimaginable pain, his body covered in burns, he made a decision. He would leave Hiroshima. He had survived the apocalypse once. What he didn't know was that it was about to happen again. Living with wounds, a brush with death. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was barely alive. His body burned, battered, and weakened. He struggled to stay conscious as he sat inside the air raid shelter. The world around him was a scene of absolute horror. The moans of the wounded, the silent tears of those who had lost everything, and the thick, choking smoke that filled the air. The pain in his left side was unbearable. His face and arms were covered in burns. His eardrums had ruptured from the explosion, and his entire body ached from the sheer force of the blast. But he was still breathing. He had survived, but at what cost? A city that no longer existed. As Yamaguchi staggered out of the shelter, he saw that Hiroshima was no longer a city. It was a wasteland of ash and death. Nothing was left. The bridges had collapsed, their metal frames twisted like vines. The railway station was reduced to a smoking ruin. Even the trees had been turned into blackened stumps, lifeless and charred. The people who had once filled the streets were either dead or dying, their bodies lying motionless, burned, or barely clinging to life. As he wandered through the destroyed city, his skin peeling from his arms, he realized he needed help. But where could he go? The hospitals were gone, the doctors dead, the city's emergency response non-existent. The search for help. Despite his injuries, Yamaguchi forced himself to move forward, desperate to find anyone who could help. He eventually stumbled upon a small aid station, where a few surviving medical personnel were trying to treat the endless stream of the wounded. But they had no supplies, no painkillers, no medicine, only makeshift bandages and water. A nurse gently wrapped his burns, but there was nothing more they could do. The station was overcrowded with hundreds of people, many of whom were dying before they could be treated. For hours, Yamaguchi sat among the wounded, his mind struggling to comprehend what had happened. He had survived an atomic bomb. How was that even possible? But his survival was not a blessing. It was a curse. A city of the dying. Everywhere he looked, he saw suffering beyond imagination. Mothers clutching their lifeless children, rocking them gently, unable to accept reality. People with skin hanging from their bones, their eyes swollen shut from the heat. Bodies piled in the streets, some still burning, the flames refusing to die. Some survivors, too burned and weak to move, simply sat in the ruins, whispering to themselves or staring at the sky, waiting for death to take them. The smell of burnt flesh filled the air, mixing with the thick black smoke still rising from the city. It was a hell unlike any other, and Yamaguchi was trapped in it. One thought, I must go home. As night fell over the destroyed Hiroshima, Yamaguchi lay on the ground, unable to sleep. His wounds throbbed with unbearable pain, and the screams of the dying filled the darkness. But in the midst of the agony, one thought remained clear in his mind. I must go home. I must get to Nagasaki. His wife, his son, were they safe? Did they know what had happened? With no idea of how, or if he would even survive the journey, Yamaguchi made a decision. He would leave Hiroshima and return to Nagasaki. He had no idea that in just 3 days, he would face the nightmare all over again. Journey to Nagasaki, survival, or a second trial. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was barely holding on to life. His body was scorched, his mind clouded with exhaustion and pain, but one thought burned within him. He had to get home. Hiroshima was gone. It was no longer a city, just a smoldering wasteland of fire, death, and radiation. But Nagasaki, his home, still existed. His wife and young son were waiting for him there. They had no idea if he was alive or dead. He had to reach them. A journey through hell. On August 7th, 1945, just 1 day after the atomic blast, Yamaguchi forced himself to move. His left side was wrapped in makeshift bandages, but his burns were deep and raw, his skin peeling with every movement. The pain was unimaginable, but he refused to stop. The train station had been obliterated, the tracks twisted like vines. He had to walk for miles through a landscape of corpses and burning rubble, just to reach the outskirts of Hiroshima, where a single railway line still functioned. The journey was a nightmare. The train was filled with wounded survivors, many of them barely clinging to life. The air inside was thick with the smell of burned flesh. Some passengers died mid-journey, their bodies slumping forward, unnoticed by others too weak to react. The train stopped frequently as soldiers and medical workers removed the dead from the carriages. Yamaguchi sat in agonizing silence, his body burning, his mind racing. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flash of light, heard the explosion, felt the fire consuming the city. But the nightmare was not over. Arrival in Nagasaki, a temporary relief. After a grueling journey of nearly 200 miles, Yamaguchi finally arrived in Nagasaki on August 8, 1945. As he stepped off the train, he felt a wave of relief. He had made it. He was home. Dragging himself through the familiar streets, he finally reached his house. His wife, Hisako, opened the door, and for a moment, she just stared at him in shock. Her husband, who had left for Hiroshima just months ago, now stood before her, covered in burns, wrapped in tattered bandages, his face barely recognizable. Tears filled her eyes as she rushed to help him inside. She didn't know the full horror of what had happened in Hiroshima, but she knew one thing. Her husband had barely survived something unimaginable. For the first time in days, Yamaguchi felt safe. His wife cleaned his wounds, and his young son sat beside him, unaware of the nightmare his father had just endured. He should have been relieved. He should have rested. But fate had other plans. A warning no one would believe. The next morning, August 9, 1945, Yamaguchi woke up in excruciating pain, but he knew he had to report to work at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in Nagasaki. Despite his wounds, despite his near-death experience, He was still a loyal worker and felt it was his duty to report what he had seen. As he arrived at the company office, he met with his supervisor and colleagues. His face still wrapped in bandages, his voice weak. He tried to warn them. Hiroshima has been destroyed by a single bomb. One explosion wiped out the entire city. We must be prepared. It could happen here. But his colleagues refused to believe him. Impossible, they said. No single bomb could destroy an entire city. You must be exaggerating. Yamaguchi pleaded with them to listen, but to them, the idea was absurd. No weapon on earth could do such a thing, could it? Then, at exactly 11:02 a.m., while he was still in the office, a familiar blinding flash filled the sky. He had survived Hiroshima. Now, he was in Nagasaki, and history was about to repeat itself. The second apocalypse, the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. On the morning of August 9th, 1945, Tsutomu Yamaguchi awoke in unbearable pain. His burns throbbed, his body was weak, and the horrors of Hiroshima's destruction were still fresh in his mind. But he had survived. He had made it home to Nagasaki, to his wife and young son, and for a brief moment he believed that the worst was over. But fate was not done with him yet. A warning that went ignored. Despite his injuries, Yamaguchi forced himself to go to work at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in Nagasaki. The war was still ongoing, and duty called. But as soon as he arrived at the office, he knew he had to warn his superiors. Gathering the strength to speak, he told his boss and colleagues what he had witnessed in Hiroshima just 3 days earlier. One bomb. Just one bomb. Hiroshima was wiped off the map. It wasn't a firebombing. It was something else. Something unimaginable. We must be prepared. But no one believed him. His supervisor scoffed at the idea. No single bomb can destroy an entire city. That's impossible, he said. Yamaguchi pleaded with them to listen, but they dismissed his warning as the exaggerations of a wounded man. Then, at exactly 11:02 a.m., while he was still in the office, a sudden, blinding white light filled the room. The flash of death. The bombing of Nagasaki. Before Yamaguchi could react, the same thing that had happened in Hiroshima happened again. A searing explosion erupted in the sky over Nagasaki. The bomb, codenamed Fat Man, was even more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. It exploded with the force of 21,000 tons of TNT, unleashing a firestorm hotter than the sun. The shockwave tore through the city, leveling everything in its path. Buildings collapsed instantly. Bridges and roads were ripped apart. A fireball consumed everything within a mile of the epicenter. People vaporized in an instant, their bodies leaving only shadows burned into walls and the ground. For the second time in just 3 days, Yamaguchi was inside the blast radius of an atomic bomb. Surviving the impossible again. The office shook violently, and the force of the explosion threw Yamaguchi to the ground. His bandages were blown away, and his fresh wounds were reburned by the intense heat. The windows shattered, sending glass flying like daggers. For a brief moment he thought, this is it. This time I won't survive, but against all odds he did. Because Nagasaki's hilly terrain partially shielded his location, he was spared from the worst of the blast. Unlike in Hiroshima, he was not in an open area but inside a reinforced building. It protected him just enough to keep him alive. But when he staggered outside, the nightmare had returned. A city engulfed in fire and death. Nagasaki, like Hiroshima before it, was now a city of fire and ash. Flames consumed entire neighborhoods. Thick, black smoke choked the air. Bodies lay motionless in the streets, some burned beyond recognition. People staggered around like ghosts, their skin peeling from their bodies, their faces unrecognizable. The once bustling city was now a graveyard. Yamaguchi, despite his own pain, had only one thought, his wife and son. Were they alive? Had they survived? A desperate search for family. Burned, bleeding, and barely able to walk, Yamaguchi stumbled through the ruins, heading toward his home. The streets were unrecognizable. filled with collapsed buildings, overturned vehicles, and corpses. With every step, he feared the worst. What if his family hadn't survived? What if he had lost everything? When he finally reached his neighborhood, his heart stopped. His home was destroyed. The wooden structure had been reduced to rubble. The fires had devoured everything. For a moment, he thought he had lost them. But then, through the smoke and dust, he heard a familiar voice. His wife, Hisako, was alive. She had been out gathering supplies when the bomb detonated. Miraculously, she and their young son had escaped the worst of the blast. When she saw Yamaguchi, his body covered in fresh burns, his face wrapped in bloodied bandages, she gasped. Not again, she whispered. She had already nursed him back to life once, and now he had somehow survived a second atomic bomb. The realization of fate. As Yamaguchi sat down, holding his son in his arms, the full weight of what had happened hit him. He had survived 2 atomic bombs. In just 3 days, he had stood at the epicenter of the 2 most powerful explosions in human history and lived to tell the tale. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a living witness to the apocalypse, twice. But his journey was far from over. The radiation was already seeping into his body. His burns were infected, and the war was about to end in the most unexpected way. What would happen next would change Japan and the world forever. The only man to survive 2 atomic bombs. Tsutomu Yamaguchi sat in the ruins of Nagasaki, his body broken, his mind shattered. His burns throbbed, his skin felt like it was on fire, and every breath was agony. Yet, against all odds, he was still alive. But at what cost? He had witnessed the end of the world, not once but twice. He had stood in Hiroshima as the city was incinerated in an instant. He had escaped only to arrive in Nagasaki, just in time for another apocalypse. He was the only person in history to survive both atomic bombings. And now, he sat there, staring at the ashes of his home, wondering if fate was playing a cruel joke on him. The weight of survival. For most, death had been instant. A flash of light, a wave of heat and nothingness. But for Yamaguchi, the nightmare refused to end. In Hiroshima, he had seen the sky explode. In Nagasaki, he had watched it happen again. Twice, he had walked through a city reduced to flames. Twice, he had heard the screams of the dying. The horror of what he had witnessed was beyond human comprehension. He was grateful that his wife and son had survived, but he could not shake the overwhelming sense of guilt and despair. Why me? Why did I live when so many died? Was I supposed to witness this? To tell the world? For days he lay weak, feverish, and hallucinating, his body battling radiation sickness. His burns worsened, his hair began falling out, and his body shook with exhaustion and trauma. His wife nursed him back to health, just as she had done when he first returned from Hiroshima. But his mind could never fully recover. He had seen the unimaginable, and no one else could truly understand what he had been through. The end of the war, the unthinkable truth. Just days later, on August 15th, 1945, a radio broadcast echoed through Japan. Emperor Hirohito's voice, a sound few had ever heard before, announced that Japan was surrendering. The war was over. Yamaguchi sat in silence as the words sank in. It was over, but at a cost beyond anything he could have imagined. Hiroshima, 140,000 dead. Nagasaki, 70,000 dead. Tens of thousands more would die in the coming months from radiation poisoning. And he, somehow, was still alive. For the rest of his life, Yamaguchi would struggle with his place in history. He was not just a survivor. He was a witness to the greatest destruction mankind had ever created. But what would he do with this second chance at life? Would he stay silent, or would he tell the world what he had seen? His journey was far from over. His true purpose had just begun. Family survival, a miracle or fate's game. As the fires of Nagasaki smoldered and the sky remained dark with smoke and ash, Tsutomu Yamaguchi, barely able to stand, turned his attention to the only thing that mattered, his family. He had miraculously survived 2 atomic bombs. But now, the question that haunted him was, had his wife and son survived as well? A city in ruins, a home destroyed. When Yamaguchi had finally reached his home after the bombing, his heart had nearly stopped. The house was gone. The wooden structure had collapsed into a heap of burning rubble. The streets that once bustled with life were now silent, except for the occasional moans of the wounded. Everything was gone. For a terrifying moment, he thought he had lost everything. But then, through the haze of dust and destruction, he heard a voice, a fateful decision that saved their lives. His wife, Hisako, emerged from the wreckage, holding their young son in her arms. They were alive. But how? It was only later that Yamaguchi learned the unbelievable reason why they had survived. On the morning of August 9th, just before the bomb was dropped, Hisako had left home with their son to buy burn ointment for her husband's Hiroshima wounds. She had been outside the city center, far enough to avoid the full force of the explosion. Had she stayed home just a little longer, she and their child would have been vaporized in an instant. It was a coincidence, a twist of fate, that had saved them. The horror of survival. Though they had lived, their nightmare was far from over. Radiation sickness had already begun to set in. Yamaguchi's burns worsened, his skin peeling away in painful layers. His wife suffered from severe nausea and fatigue, a sign of radiation poisoning. Their son, though seemingly unhurt, would later develop long-term health issues. The days after the bombing were a battle for survival. Food was scarce. The fires had burned most of the city's food supplies, and relief efforts were slow. Water was dangerous. The bomb had poisoned the rivers, and those who drank from them died within days. Infections spread rapidly. The wounded lay untreated, their burns turning to open sores, their bodies too weak to fight off disease. Yamaguchi and Hisako tended to each other's wounds, using whatever little resources they could find. They had survived the explosions, but now they had to survive the aftermath. The psychological toll, the burden of memory. Survival was one thing. Living with the memory was another. Yamaguchi had seen 2 cities die. Hisako had seen her husband return from hell, only to be thrown back into it. Their son had escaped death, but the bomb's shadow would follow him for life. The images of burned bodies, collapsed buildings, and endless suffering haunted them. Even in sleep, the nightmares refused to end. Every time they heard a loud noise, their bodies flinched, expecting another explosion. Every time they looked at each other, they saw the pain, the scars, the weight of surviving what millions hadn't. A miracle or just luck? As they struggled to rebuild their lives, Yamaguchi often wondered, was his survival a miracle or just cruel fate? Why had he lived when so many had perished? Was there a reason, a purpose? He had once been an ordinary man, a simple engineer who wanted nothing more than a peaceful life. But now, he was something else entirely. A man who had twice stood at the heart of an atomic apocalypse and lived to tell the tale. But would he tell it? Would the world listen? Would anyone even believe what he had been through? His survival wasn't just about his own life anymore. It was about what he would do with it. Would he stay silent, or would he speak out? Would he fade into history, or would he fight to make sure history never repeated itself? Post-war world, living in the shadow of death. The war had ended. Japan had surrendered. But for Tsutomu Yamaguchi and the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the struggle for survival was far from over. Though the bombs had stopped falling, their effects lingered, poisoning the land, the air, and the bodies of those who had lived through the explosions. Japan in ruins. By September 1945, Japan was barely recognizable. The 2 atomic bombs had brought the war to an abrupt end, but they had also left deep scars on the nation's people and land. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were flattened. The cities, once bustling with life, were now graveyards of ash and ruins. Millions of people were homeless. Entire families had been wiped out, leaving orphaned children wandering the streets, begging for food. Radiation sickness spread silently. Those who had survived the initial blast began falling sick, vomiting, losing hair, developing painful sores on their skin. Many died weeks or months later. The economy had collapsed. Factories were destroyed. Food production was nearly impossible, and hunger became a national crisis. The war was over, but for the survivors, the battle had just begun. Yamaguchi struggled to rebuild his life. Tsutomu Yamaguchi had already faced death twice, but now he had to face life in a broken country. Despite his severe burns, radiation sickness, and the trauma of witnessing 2 atomic explosions, he refused to give up. He returned to work at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, even though many of his co-workers were now dead. He and his Sako rebuilt their home, trying to create a sense of normalcy for their young son. He battled his declining health, suffering from chronic pain, fatigue, and depression caused by the radiation. Every day was a reminder of what he had endured. Every time he looked at his scars, he remembered the blinding flash, the shockwave, the firestorm. Every time he walked through Nagasaki, he saw the shadows of the dead burned into walls, the ruins of homes, the hollow faces of survivors who had lost everything, living with radiation's curse. Yamaguchi, like many atomic bomb survivors, known as Hibakusha, suffered from severe health problems in the years after the war. He lost all his hair temporarily due to radiation exposure. He suffered constant dizziness, nausea, and weakness. He developed recurring infections and skin diseases. The radiation increases risk of cancer. For many, surviving the bomb didn't mean escaping death. It just meant delaying it. Thousands of survivors died young, their bodies slowly deteriorating from the invisible poison that had seeped into their cells. No one knew how long they would live. Discrimination against survivors. Instead of being treated as heroes, Hibakusha were often shunned by society. People feared they carried an unknown disease. Employers refused to hire them because of their weak health. Women who had survived the bomb were rejected for marriage, as men feared they would give birth to sick children. Yamaguchi, despite his education and experience, also faced discrimination. People looked at his scars and avoided him, as if he were cursed. But he refused to let his suffering define him, a decision that changed his life. For years, Yamaguchi kept his pain and trauma locked inside. He rarely spoke about what had happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He simply wanted to move on, to live a quiet life, to raise his family. But as time passed, he realized he couldn't stay silent forever. He had survived not 1, but 2 atomic bombs. He had been given a second chance at life, twice. And he began to wonder, had he been spared for a reason? Was it his destiny to tell the world what he had seen? His true mission was about to begin. He was no longer just a survivor. He would become a voice for the dead, a messenger of peace. Physical and mental wounds, an unbearable reality. Surviving 2 atomic bombs was an unimaginable fate, but living with the aftermath proved to be an even greater challenge for Tsutomu Yamaguchi. The explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki had burned his skin, shattered his eardrums, and poisoned his body with deadly radiation. But the physical wounds were only part of the nightmare. The mental scars ran even deeper. The silent killer, radiation's long-term effects. For the first few weeks after the bombings, Yamaguchi's entire body ached. He suffered from fever, dizziness, and unbearable fatigue. But he tried to convince himself that with time, his wounds would heal. He was wrong. Radiation exposure was a slow and merciless killer. Its effects did not disappear with time. They only grew worse. His hair began falling out in clumps. His burns refused to heal properly, leaving his skin permanently scarred and hypersensitive to touch. He suffered from chronic infections. His immune system weakened beyond repair. His vision blurred, and his hearing, already damaged from the blast, continued to deteriorate. Worst of all, he knew that his body had been poisoned on a cellular level. Radiation did not just wound. It rewrote DNA, altering the body from the inside out. He, like many other survivors, had a constant fear of developing cancer. Living in the shadow of death, the knowledge that his own body could betray him at any moment haunted him every day. Doctors had little understanding of radiation sickness, and there were no real treatments available. Many hibakusha, including Yamaguchi, lived in constant uncertainty, not knowing if they had months, years, or even decades left before the radiation would take its toll. Each time he visited the doctor, he saw friends and fellow survivors growing weaker, falling ill, and dying long before their time. It was like watching a slow-motion version of the bombings, where the destruction unfolded not in seconds, but over years. The psychological toll, a mind trapped in trauma. If the radiation was a poison to his body, the memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were a poison to his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flash of light. Every time he heard a loud sound, his body flinched, expecting another explosion. Every time he smelled burning food or fire, he was back in the ruins of the city, surrounded by the screams of the dying. Survivor's guilt consumed him. Why did I live when so many others died? Was I just lucky, or was there some purpose to my survival? What if I had died instead? Would it have been easier? The burden of having witnessed 2 atomic apocalypses was too heavy to carry alone. But for years, he refused to talk about it. He didn't want to relive the horror. He didn't want to pass his pain on to his family. So, he suffered in silence. The stigma of the hibakusha, like many atomic bomb survivors, Yamaguchi became part of the hibakusha community, a group that was not only suffering physically but also socially rejected. People feared them, believing that radiation sickness was contagious. Employers refused to hire them, thinking they were too weak to work. Many women hibakusha were abandoned or never married, as men feared their children would be born with deformities. Yamaguchi, despite being an intelligent and skilled engineer, struggled to find acceptance. He felt like a living ghost, someone who had walked through death but never truly escaped it. An endless fight against pain. Over the years, Yamaguchi battled countless health problems. Stomach issues from radiation poisoning made eating difficult. Skin disorders left him constantly in pain. Headaches, nausea, and fatigue never went away. In his later years, he developed cataracts, a common radiation-related condition. He was eventually diagnosed with cancer, something he had feared ever since 1945. Every day was a reminder that the bombs had not just destroyed cities. They had left behind a slow, invisible killer that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. A life defined by pain, but not defeated by it. Despite his lifelong suffering, Yamaguchi refused to let his pain define him. He still worked. He still loved his family. He still found reasons to smile. And eventually, he made a decision that would change his life forever. Instead of burying his trauma, he would use it for a purpose. He would tell the world what had happened to him. He would fight for peace. Because if his suffering could stop even one more nuclear bomb from being dropped, then maybe, just maybe, it would all have been worth it. A living testament, a message to the world. For decades, Tsutomu Yamaguchi carried the weight of survival in silence. He was not just an atomic bomb survivor. He was the only known person to have endured 2 nuclear explosions and lived to tell the tale. But for years, he didn't tell it. The pain was too raw, the memories too horrifying. The world had moved on, but he was still living in the shadow of the bombs. Yet as time passed, he realized that his survival was more than just fate. It was a responsibility. He had seen what nuclear weapons could do, not in theory, not in numbers, but with his own eyes. He had walked through the ruins of 2 cities. He had held the dying in his arms, and he had felt the slow poison of radiation in his own body. If anyone could speak against nuclear war, it was him. Becoming a voice for the hibakusha. By the 1950s and 1960s, Japan had started rebuilding, and the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the hibakusha, began to organize. They were still suffering from radiation sickness, cancer, and discrimination, yet the government offered little to no support. Yamaguchi saw this injustice and decided to break his silence. He began speaking about his experiences, sharing the truth of what had happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He gave interviews to newspapers and television stations. He joined anti-nuclear campaigns, advocating for peace. He wrote about his experience, ensuring that future generations would never forget. His message was clear. Nuclear weapons must never be used again. Recognition by the Japanese government. For years, the Japanese government was reluctant to acknowledge his unique case. Survivors of one atomic bomb were already rare, but someone who had survived two? It seemed unbelievable, even to them. However, in 2009, after decades of activism, the Japanese government finally officially recognized Yamaguchi as a double hibakusha, the only known survivor of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the age of 93, he stood before the world as a living testament to nuclear destruction. Speaking to the United Nations, Yamaguchi's fight was not just for Japan, it was for the entire world. In his later years, he traveled and spoke at international conferences, warning world leaders about the catastrophic consequences of nuclear war. He addressed the United Nations, urging countries to abolish nuclear weapons. He met with activists, students, and scientists, sharing his story. He became a symbol of resilience and peace, showing the world the human cost of nuclear war. In one of his most powerful speeches, he said, "The only people who should have the right to use nuclear weapons are those who have lived through them." Hollywood's interest, the story that had to be told. Yamaguchi's story gained worldwide attention. Writers, filmmakers, and historians wanted to document his life, recognizing that his experience was one of the most extraordinary survival stories in history. His testimony inspired books, documentaries, and films. Yet he remained humble, insisting that he was just one of thousands of survivors who had suffered. His goal was not fame. It was justice, remembrance, and peace. The ultimate message, never again, even in his old age. Despite decades of pain, radiation sickness, and personal loss, Yamaguchi never gave up his mission. He believed that his survival had a purpose: to tell the world what he had seen, to warn future generations, and to fight against the spread of nuclear weapons. Before his death in 2010, he left behind a simple yet powerful message. "I have no hatred for America, but I want the world to know that nuclear weapons are a mistake. No human being should ever have to go through what I went through. Never again." His words still echo today, reminding the world of the horrors of war, the resilience of the human spirit, and the urgent need for peace. The struggle of a peace ambassador. Surviving 2 atomic bombings had defined Tsutomu Yamaguchi's existence, but it did not break him. Instead, it gave him a mission: to ensure that no one else would ever suffer as he had. For decades, he lived in pain, haunted by the images of burning cities and dying people. But he refused to remain silent. His survival was not just a matter of chance. It was a responsibility. From silence to activism. For years after the war, Yamaguchi focused on rebuilding his life, raising his family, and dealing with his chronic health issues. But the memories never faded, and neither did his sense of duty. By the 1950s and 1960s, as the world entered the Cold War, nuclear weapons became more powerful, more advanced, and more dangerous than ever before. Countries raced to build bigger bombs, deadlier warheads, and faster delivery systems. Yamaguchi watched in horror as the world ignored the lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He could no longer stay silent. Fighting for nuclear abolition, Yamaguchi joined global peace movements, traveling across Japan and beyond to warn the world about the horrors of nuclear weapons. He gave speeches at universities, government meetings, and conferences. He met with survivors, scientists, and world leaders, urging them to abandon nuclear arms. He shared his personal testimony with young generations, hoping they would carry his message forward. His mission was not political, nor driven by revenge. He simply wanted the world to understand one thing: nuclear weapons must never be used again. A voice in the United Nations. Yamaguchi's fight reached a global stage when he was invited to speak at the United Nations, where world leaders debated nuclear policies. Standing before diplomats and politicians, He shared his story as the only man who had survived 2 atomic bombs. His words were simple but unforgettable. I beg you, as a human being, do not think of nuclear weapons as a necessary evil. They are an absolute evil. Many in the audience wept as he described the agony of radiation burns, the cries of the dying, and the shadows of the dead imprinted on the walls of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For the first time, the world saw the reality of nuclear war, not through statistics, but through the eyes of someone who had lived through it, challenging the world's superpowers. Despite his age and frailty, Yamaguchi never stopped challenging world powers that continued to stockpile nuclear weapons. He criticized the U.S. and Soviet Union for their nuclear arms race. He condemned nations that tested bombs, knowing firsthand the suffering they would cause. He urged Japan to take a stronger stance against nuclear proliferation, reminding them of their own history. His activism took him to Europe, America, and across Asia, where he worked alongside other Hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors, in their fight for nuclear disarmament. Letters to world leaders. Yamaguchi knew that change would not come easily, so he personally wrote letters to world leaders, pleading with them to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. In 2005, at the age of 89, he wrote a powerful letter to U.S. President Barack Obama, asking him to visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In his letter, he wrote, "You are the president of a country that dropped the atomic bombs. Please come and see what your country has done. Look with your own eyes, listen with your own ears, and understand. Only then can you make the right decisions." Years later, in 2016, President Obama became the first U.S. president to visit Hiroshima. Yamaguchi did not live to see it, but his words had finally reached the highest level of power. A message carved in history. Yamaguchi's final years were spent writing books, giving interviews, and making sure his story was never forgotten. He knew he wouldn't live forever, but his message could. Before his death in 2010, at the age of 93, he gave one last statement. If humans do not eliminate nuclear weapons, then nuclear weapons will eliminate humans. His life was a testament to resilience, his suffering a warning to the world, and his words a plea for peace. The legacy of a man who survived the apocalypse. Today, Tsutomu Yamaguchi's name is etched in history, not just as a survivor, but as a fighter. His story is taught in schools, reminding students of the horrors of nuclear war. His face appears in documentaries and films, ensuring his message is heard by future generations. His efforts inspired governments to rethink their nuclear policies, proving that one man's voice can change the world. He endured the worst of human destruction, but he spent the rest of his life fighting for human survival. He was not just a survivor. He was a peace warrior. He was Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the man who survived 2 atomic bombs and still believed in peace. A unique chapter in history. Tsutomu Yamaguchi's story was so unbelievable, so extraordinary, that for many years the world did not fully acknowledge it. To most people, surviving 1 atomic bomb was already an unimaginable feat. But surviving 2? That sounded impossible. For decades, Yamaguchi lived in relative obscurity, his story known only to those around him. But as the years passed, the world slowly began to recognize his journey, not just as a tale of survival, but as a crucial lesson for humanity. The story that took decades to be heard. For years, Yamaguchi's experience remained largely unknown outside Japan. Even within his own country, few people knew the full extent of what he had endured. Most assumed that Hibakusha survivors were only from Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Not both. It wasn't until the 2000s, more than half a century after the bombings, that his story began to gain global recognition. Media, documentaries, and books. As interest in Hiroshima and Nagasaki grew, historians, journalists, and filmmakers sought out survivors to tell their stories. When they learned about Yamaguchi, the only officially recognized double survivor, his story became a worldwide phenomenon. Books and articles were written about his life. Documentaries featured his interviews, where he recounted the horrors he had witnessed. Historians recognized him as a living testimony of nuclear devastation. One of the most poignant moments came when filmmaker James Cameron, director of Titanic and Avatar, expressed interest in making a film about Yamaguchi's life, stating that his story was one of the most powerful survival tales in human history. Why did the world finally listen? The reason Tsutomu Yamaguchi's story resonated so deeply with people across the globe was because it was more than just survival. It was about the true cost of war. He wasn't just an individual who had escaped death twice. He was a symbol of resilience, of the horrors of nuclear weapons, and of the urgent need for peace. His story forced people to confront the reality of atomic warfare, not in terms of politics or military strategy, but in terms of human suffering. What the world can learn from Yamaguchi's story. Yamaguchi's life teaches us many powerful lessons. 1. War leaves no winners. Both Japan and the United States suffered immensely from World War II. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just military targets. They were cities full of ordinary people. The use of atomic bombs changed warfare forever, proving that a single weapon could wipe out an entire civilization. 2. The human spirit is unbreakable. Despite horrific injuries, radiation sickness, and witnessing mass death, Yamaguchi refused to give up on life. He worked, he loved, he raised a family, and he dedicated his later years to spreading peace. His story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, survival is possible. 3. Nuclear weapons must never be used again. Yamaguchi did not hate America, nor did he seek revenge. He only wanted the world to never repeat the mistakes of 1945. His testimony helped strengthen anti-nuclear movements, urging governments to reduce and abolish nuclear weapons. His life's work asks us, if someone who survived 2 atomic bombs can fight for peace, why can't we? An enduring legacy. When Tsutomu Yamaguchi passed away in 2010, he left behind more than just a story. He left behind a warning. His name is now etched in history, standing as a symbol of both human resilience and the horrors of war. His words continue to inspire anti-nuclear activists around the world. His survival reminds us that history must never be forgotten, because if we forget, we risk repeating it. A message that lives on. Even today, in a world where nuclear weapons still exist, Yamaguchi's voice echoes through time. We must not allow any more Nagasaki's or Hiroshimas. Nuclear weapons are the ultimate evil, and they must be abolished. His story is not just a chapter in history. It is a warning for the future, and it is up to us whether we listen or let history repeat itself. A voice in the United Nations. Yamaguchi's fight reached a global stage when he was invited to speak at the United Nations, where world leaders debated nuclear policies. Standing before diplomats and politicians, he shared his story as the only man who had survived 2 atomic bombs. His words were simple but unforgettable. I beg you, as a human being, do not think of nuclear weapons as a necessary evil. They are an absolute evil. Many in the audience wept as he described the agony of radiation burns, the cries of the dying, and the shadows of the dead imprinted on the walls of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For the first time, the world saw the reality of nuclear war, not through statistics, but through the eyes of someone who had lived through it, challenging the world's superpowers. Despite his age and frailty, Yamaguchi never stopped challenging world powers that continued to stockpile nuclear weapons. He criticized the U.S. and Soviet Union for their nuclear arms race. He condemned nations that tested bombs, knowing firsthand the suffering they would cause. He urged Japan to take a stronger stance against nuclear proliferation, reminding them of their own history. His activism took him to Europe, America, and across Asia, where he worked alongside other Hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors, in their fight for nuclear disarmament. Letters to world leaders. Yamaguchi knew that change would not come easily, so he personally wrote letters to world leaders, pleading with them to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. In 2005, at the age of 89, he wrote a powerful letter to U.S. President Barack Obama, asking him to visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In his letter, he wrote, "You are the president of a country that dropped the atomic bombs. Please come and see what your country has done. Look with your own eyes, listen with your own ears, and understand. Only then can you make the right decisions. Years later, in 2016, President Obama became the first U.S. president to visit Hiroshima. Yamaguchi did not live to see it, but his words had finally reached the highest level of power. A message carved in history. Yamaguchi's final years were spent writing books, giving interviews, and making sure his story was never forgotten. He knew he wouldn't live forever, but his message could. Before his death in 2010, at the age of 93, he gave one last statement. If humans do not eliminate nuclear weapons, then nuclear weapons will eliminate humans. His life was a testament to resilience, his suffering a warning to the world, and his words a plea for peace. The legacy of a man who survived the apocalypse. Today, Tsutomu Yamaguchi's name is etched in history, not just as a survivor, but as a fighter. His story is taught in schools, reminding students of the horrors of nuclear war. His face appears in documentaries and films, ensuring his message is heard by future generations. His efforts inspired governments to rethink their nuclear policies, proving that one man's voice can change the world. He endured the worst of human destruction, but he spent the rest of his life fighting for human survival. He was not just a survivor. He was a peace warrior. He was Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the man who survived 2 atomic bombs and still believed in peace. A unique chapter in history. Tsutomu Yamaguchi's story was so unbelievable, so extraordinary, that for many years the world did not fully acknowledge it. To most people, surviving 1 atomic bomb was already an unimaginable feat. But surviving 2? That sounded impossible. For decades, Yamaguchi lived in relative obscurity, his story known only to those around him. But as the years passed, the world slowly began to recognize his journey, not just as a tale of survival, but as a crucial lesson for humanity. The story that took decades to be heard. For years, Yamaguchi's experience remained largely unknown outside Japan. Even within his own country, few people knew the full extent of what he had endured. Most assumed that Hibakusha survivors were only from Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Not both. It wasn't until the 2000s, more than half a century after the bombings, that his story began to gain global recognition. Media, documentaries, and books. As interest in Hiroshima and Nagasaki grew, historians, journalists, and filmmakers sought out survivors to tell their stories. When they learned about Yamaguchi, the only officially recognized double survivor, his story became a worldwide phenomenon. Books and articles were written about his life. Documentaries featured his interviews, where he recounted the horrors he had witnessed. Historians recognized him as a living testimony of nuclear devastation. One of the most poignant moments came when filmmaker James Cameron, director of Titanic and Avatar, expressed interest in making a film about Yamaguchi's life, stating that his story was one of the most powerful survival tales in human history. Why did the world finally listen? The reason Tsutomu Yamaguchi's story resonated so deeply with people across the globe was because it was more than just survival. It was about the true cost of war. He wasn't just an individual who had escaped death twice. He was a symbol of resilience, of the horrors of nuclear weapons, and of the urgent need for peace. His story forced people to confront the reality of atomic warfare, not in terms of politics or military strategy, but in terms of human suffering. What the world can learn from Yamaguchi's story. Yamaguchi's life teaches us many powerful lessons. 1. War leaves no winners. Both Japan and the United States suffered immensely from World War II. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just military targets. They were cities full of ordinary people. The use of atomic bombs changed warfare forever, proving that a single weapon could wipe out an entire civilization. 2. The human spirit is unbreakable. Despite horrific injuries, radiation sickness, and witnessing mass death, Yamaguchi refused to give up on life. He worked, he loved, he raised a family, and he dedicated his later years to spreading peace. His story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, survival is possible. 3. Nuclear weapons must never be used again. Yamaguchi did not hate America, nor did he seek revenge. He only wanted the world to never repeat the mistakes of 1945. His testimony helped strengthen anti-nuclear movements, urging governments to reduce and abolish nuclear weapons. His life's work asks us, if someone who survived 2 atomic bombs can fight for peace, why can't we? An enduring legacy. When Tsutomu Yamaguchi passed away in 2010, he left behind more than just a story. He left behind a warning. His name is now etched in history, standing as a symbol of both human resilience and the horrors of war. His words continue to inspire anti-nuclear activists around the world. His survival reminds us that history must never be forgotten, because if we forget, we risk repeating it. A message that lives on. Even today, in a world where nuclear weapons still exist, Yamaguchi's voice echoes through time. We must not allow any more Nagasaki's or Hiroshimas. Nuclear weapons are the ultimate evil, and they must be abolished. His story is not just a chapter in history. It is a warning for the future, and it is up to us whether we listen or let history repeat itself. The most unlucky or the luckiest man in history. The story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi is so extraordinary that it sparks a debate that has no clear answer. Was he the most unfortunate man to ever live, or was he the luckiest? Few people in history have faced death on such an apocalyptic scale. Not once, but twice. He stood at the epicenter of 2 nuclear explosions, witnessed the destruction of 2 cities, and yet he walked away from both alive. So, was he cursed, or was he blessed? The case for the unluckiest man in history. Those who call Yamaguchi the most unfortunate man in history point to the unbelievable suffering he endured. He was in Hiroshima at the exact moment the first atomic bomb exploded, suffering severe burns and radiation poisoning. He escaped, only to arrive in Nagasaki just in time for the second bomb. He spent his entire life suffering from radiation sickness, battling pain, illness, and survivor's guilt. He saw thousands of people die in front of him. Friends, colleagues, strangers, all burned alive or vaporized in an instant. He spent decades being ignored by his own government and was forced to fight for recognition. Surviving 1 atomic bomb is an unimaginable tragedy. Surviving 2? That is the definition of cruel fate. If there was a list of the world's most unfortunate people, surely Tsutomu Yamaguchi would be at the very top. The case for the luckiest man in history. But what if we look at his story from another perspective? What if instead of being the most unfortunate man, he was actually the luckiest? He survived 2 atomic bombs, something no one else in recorded history has done. Despite suffering horrific injuries, he recovered and lived to the age of 93, far longer than most Hibakusha. His wife and son also survived, despite being in Nagasaki during the second bombing. He lived long enough to see his story inspire the world and be officially recognized as a double survivor. He turned his suffering into a purpose, using his survival to fight for nuclear disarmament and spread a message of peace. Instead of dying twice, fate gave him a second and then a third chance at life. If there was ever a person who cheated death, it was Tsutomu Yamaguchi. Fate, destiny, or pure coincidence? Yamaguchi himself often struggled with this question. He never claimed to be lucky or unlucky. He simply believed that his survival was meant to serve a purpose. He once said, "I could have died twice, but I am alive. Maybe that means I have a duty to tell my story." Perhaps his life was not about luck or misfortune. Perhaps it was about fate giving him a responsibility. If he had died in Hiroshima, he would have been one of thousands, lost in the flames of history. But he lived, and because he lived, he became a voice for the dead, a messenger of peace, a warning to future generations. So, what is the answer? Was Tsutomu Yamaguchi the most unfortunate man in history? Or was he the luckiest? The truth is, he was both. He was a man who saw hell, walked through fire, and lived to tell the tale. And in doing so, he ensured that his suffering would not be in vain. His story is not just about luck or bad luck. It is about resilience, survival, and the power of the human spirit. Perhaps, in the end, he was not defined by what happened to him, but by what he did with his survival. And that, more than anything else, makes him one of the most extraordinary humans in history. Final message: a lesson on peace, war, and survival. The story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi is not just a tale of survival. It is a warning, a lesson, and a call to action. It is a testament to the horrors of war, the resilience of the human spirit, and the price of nuclear weapons. It forces us to ask ourselves, how close are we to repeating history? What would happen if nuclear weapons were used again? Have we truly learned from Hiroshima and Nagasaki? The truth is we are still standing on the edge of the same abyss that swallowed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in fire and ash. Even today, the world possesses enough nuclear weapons to destroy humanity multiple times over. We live in a time where nations threaten war, expand their nuclear arsenals, and justify violence in the name of security. But what Tsutomu Yamaguchi's story teaches us is that true security does not come from weapons. It comes from peace. A survivor's warning to the world. Before his death, Yamaguchi left behind a powerful message, one that should echo in the hearts of every person, every leader, every nation. If humans do not abolish nuclear weapons, then nuclear weapons will abolish humans. This is not just history. This is our reality, and the choice is in our hands. Do we allow history to repeat itself? Or do we learn from it, so that no city, no family, no child ever has to experience what Yamaguchi and millions of others suffered? A call to action, the responsibility of every human being. This story is not meant to just be watched and forgotten. It is meant to make us think, reflect, and act. If we want a future without the shadow of nuclear war, we must educate ourselves and others about the dangers of nuclear weapons. Support global efforts to reduce and eliminate nuclear arms. Demand peace from world leaders and reject policies that promote war. Choose dialogue over destruction, diplomacy over devastation. Yamaguchi's final legacy, a message for future generations. Tsutomu Yamaguchi witnessed the apocalypse twice, but he did not let it turn him into a man of hate. Instead, he fought for peace until his last breath, so that the world would not make the same mistake again. Now, the question remains, will we listen, or will we allow history to repeat itself? The choice is ours. If this story moved you, share it. Spread the message. Keep the warning alive. And let's work together for a world where peace prevails over destruction. Subscribe to our channel. Leave your thoughts in the comments and let us know, what do you think is the greatest lesson from Tsutomu Yamaguchi's story? Until next time, stay aware, stay informed, and never stop fighting for peace. Thank you and call to action. Thank you for staying with us through this incredible and thought-provoking journey into the life of Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the man who survived 2 atomic bombings and dedicated his life to peace. His story is not just history. It is a lesson, a warning, and a responsibility that we all must carry forward. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, then don't let it stop here. Share this video with your friends and family so more people can learn about this powerful message. Comment below, what are your thoughts on Yamaguchi's story? Was he the most unlucky man or the luckiest? Subscribe to our channel for more deep, untold, and shocking real-life stories from history. Your voice matters. Your awareness matters. And together, we can ensure that history's greatest mistakes are never repeated. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay aware, and never stop seeking the truth. Until next time, this is Crime Chronicles Confidential, signing off.